in the talk. Okay, so I do have a slide set like so many of us use. I'll walk you through that, but again, please stop me anytime. And the whole idea of this class is to try and help you all achieve success in biomechanics. And here's my thoughts about the best ways to do that. Okay, so let's go. After almost 40 years, I know it seems weird every time I look on the calendar, of teaching students biomechanics and kinesiology, it is my pleasure to try and share what I hope are good tips for biomechanics classes in general, and specifically our biomechanics class here at USA. I was a practicing physical therapist. Actually, I'd only been out of school about 5 or 6 years myself. And people kept saying, "Oh, Leonard, you're really good at explaining things to patients. You should think of maybe becoming a teacher." And, a job opened up where I was living at the time. And, a quick 40 years later, here I am giving the same talk. Okay, so I'm always looking for shortcuts. Usually they're a bad idea. It means I'm lazy. But when they work well, we call them efficiency. So I think there's lots of good ways to try and look for shortcuts. I don't look at it as a bad idea. It's a good idea. And if those of you that are in our residential programs, usually when you take our biomechanics class, you're taking like 19 credits. So time is really at a premium. So I'll share with you what I think are some shortcuts. There's an old saying, good generals think about strategies. Great generals think about logistics. The picture you're looking at is H. Norman Schwarzkopf. He was the commander of the U.S. and Allied forces back in, holy cow, I think 93, when the Iraqis took over Kuwait, and the U.S. put a coalition together to move them out of Kuwait. He's also got a great biography. If you're interested and have the time to read an autobiography, it's a great memoir. I like it a lot. He was a great logistics expert. Strategy is a careful plan or method for achieving a particular goal over a long period of time. Logistics are the things that have to be done to plan and organize a complicated activity. So my first tip is, even though the talk is called strategy, I'll suggest you think about logistics, the things you have to do and organize. Personal logistics is the biggest challenge, I think, and I don't think they're easy, because it really involves asking yourself, like, how can I arrange my whole daily life so I can have my very best performance on the day I'm taking an exam or a quiz? And for me, and I think for a lot of people, the hardest thing is learning to ask for help. It's a sign of weakness. People are embarrassed about it. But if we can all overcome that, new worlds can open for us when we ask other people for help. So that's something I learned the hard way. Then I also have another personal hero, this picture of this other old guy, Andre Segovia, great guitar player of the 20th century, another personal hero of mine. And he has a quote that says, "Artists who say they practice 8 hours every day are either liars or fools." I think that applies to being a graduate student in a physical therapy program. I'm not sure we can actually all give our all 8 hours a day consistently for a long period of time. It's a good idea to include other things in our daily schedules. that give us pleasure, that are satisfying. People try studying all the time. I think sometimes fail to realize that we can get stupider when we study when we're not really sharp. And that certainly applies to a course like biomechanics. Okay, I haven't lost anybody yet. No questions yet. I'll keep on going. So, formally speaking, biomechanics is a study of the mechanical behavior of biological systems. In our program, biomechanics is the study of the mechanical behavior of the human movement system. And in a nutshell, it's understanding mechanical principles and applying them to a really good knowledge of anatomy. So when we analyze students who have trouble with biomechanics classes, it's very often students who are also have not mastered anatomy. Biomechanical principles are summarized most easily in Newtonian laws. And this picture is actually the edition of Principia Mathematica, written by Isaac Newton back in 1686. I think biggest problem our students have is that they learn about biomechanics like they think an adult should learn. I think sometimes it's better to learn about mechanics the way a kid learns. So, for example, there's a term in mechanics called the angle of repose. You can memorize a formula for computing it. Arctangent times 2 times the height times the depth minus the height. And for those of us that haven't taken math recently, like, this means nothing. But if I explain a little bit more to you about it, the angle of repose is basically the steepest angle you can pile dirt on. And you learned about that when you were playing in a sandbox, hopefully with your buddies. Like, oh, like I can make more stuff with wet sand and pile it higher and shape it than dry sand. So I guess wet sand has what we would call a higher angle of repose than dry sand. So you try and learn about these things, if you can, by actually putting your hands on them, by doing something, and you learn to make the big distinctions before getting caught in all the details. Okay, your textbook that we use, it's filled with some illustrations, lots of them that look kind of like this. I don't like this illustration at all. I'll ask you all to look at it for a minute or two. And, let me know, like, what it tells you. Okay, I'll come back to it. I like this illustration better. Okay, so there's a line. It's supposed to be a model of your thigh, seen in the sagittal plane from the right. There is the knee joint. There's the shank, the lower limb segment. And this red arrow represents the force of gravity acting on the mass of the shank. Now, the question we want to ask based on this diagram is, maintaining which position requires more quadriceps effort? Oh, well, let's see. Well, if you're sitting in a chair, you probably have this position now. Your knees flexed to 90. Gravity's not trying to flex your knee at all. You can also explain this that the line of force goes through the axis. So to create a torque, you have to have a distance between the force application and the axis. This illustration, it shows somebody sitting in a chair. There's their thigh, there's their lower leg. They're holding it out straight in front of them. And you can tell subjectively, if you want to put your hand on your own thigh, this requires a fair amount of quadriceps effort. So you see, nothing has changed except the position of the shank. Oh. Okay, now the mistake here is that there's way too much information for somebody to get quickly. The point is the same. Okay, so in an effort to try and be somewhat realistic about the mass of the leg, where the center of mass of the leg is, the mass of the weight, we've made this much more complicated than it needs to be. Biomechanics as a science is meant to make all the other things about understanding human movement easier instead of harder. So, yet another suggestion: simplify. Almost to the point of stupidity. Okay. We divide biomechanics into two parts. There's kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics is the study of the movements themselves. Kinetics is the study of the forces associated with those movements. Now, the kinematics are much easier than kinetics. It's just a matter of visualizing the human body. And, we have complete anatomy, I think some of you use, the visible body anatomy, and Ackland's video atlas are available through our library. There's lots of tools to help us understand the movements themselves. The kinetics are much more difficult because you don't see the forces. So as you plan your time, the kinematic part will go quickly. The kinetic part is the part that's much more difficult. Okay, so the implicit objective of the class is to help you have models, simplified representations that help you understand physical therapy from the perspective of biomechanics. Now, it's not the type of model that's just a good-looking person. Sorry. But things like strings, like plastic bony models, like pictures, like equations, simple statements. And be careful with the simple statements. They're here in biomechanics to make things simpler. They're not the same as holistic clinical reasoning. In our biomechanics class, we save lots of time and trouble by pretending or modeling the human body as if it was a machine without a psychological aspect, without a spiritual dimension, without a physiological dimension. And I think narrowing that field helps a lot in gaining success. Okay, let me just pause for a minute. Questions anybody has, comments? Suggestions? Okay, I'll keep on going, seeing none. But I do not consider it rude in the slightest. If you want to unmute yourself and share a comment or a question, that's completely all right with me. Okay. Analyzing something from the perspective of biomechanics is the separation of the whole movement into its component parts. So in this class, you're well served by looking at an individual joint, and going further, looking at the way that joint moves in a specific plane or about a specific axis, looking at movements individually, looking at individual forces, and even looking at single anatomical structures. So you try and narrow the concept or the topic down into lots of small little chunks. And that way you can have a much better and I think more productive time studying and learning. Another definition of analysis is clarification of an expression by an elucidation of its use in discourse. In other words, just talking about things. And I think we underestimate the value of speaking with each other, you and your classmates, you with your teachers, about the topic and about the implications. As you do this, it's a good idea to try and summarize any individual concept into an illustration or a statement that can be understood like 10 seconds or less. And I think that effort to try and summarize quickly will help you a lot to gain success in this class as well as in the others. Okay. So some examples of biomechanical analysis. And for the students here from Miami, forgive me, it's the same example I know I've used in class. Deep versus parallel squats. You know, you're doing squatting as an exercise. Do you try and get your butt all the way to the ground? Or do you stop when your thigh is about parallel to the ground? Both things have their relative advantages and disadvantages. And another thing to be careful for in this class is definitions. Advantage, the way we usually use it in language, is like an advantage somebody has over another person. The term mechanical advantage is a specific number, a ratio of the length of the internal moment arm to an external moment arm. So be careful with all the language and try and force yourself to use the language that's in the textbook and in the lectures and labs. Okay, so why my son avoids deep squats at his CrossFit class. I have a son, all my children are adults now, and he loves CrossFit. He's been going for a long time. But he always, when he gets a new instructor, new coach, he often has discussion with him because when they're doing their squats, he'll only go down part way. He won't do deep squats. Okay, so I'm to blame in part because of that. I have degenerative joint disease of my knees. There's a strong genetic correlate to it. So my son, I think, is rightfully concerned that he'll develop knee arthritis later on. One reason he goes to CrossFit is to try and stay fit, stay strong, stay flexible. Okay, so can we analyze this deep versus parallel squats? Well, you can, and I'll try and show it to you in that 10-second or less rule if I can. Here's a picture from the textbook, the Newman textbook that we currently use. I want you to notice two things about the knee in extension versus the knee in flexion. First is the ligaments that support the knee tend to be slack when your knee is flexed and taut when your knee is extended. So the ligaments prevent a lot of shifting and sliding that's unwanted when the knee is in extension. I'd like you to also notice the amount of contact area. This odd shape of the distal end of the femur means that when you're extended, the forces are spread out over a large area. Excuse me. When the knee is flexed, the forces are concentrated in a small area. Pressure is defined as force per unit area. So while the mass of the person is the same, contact pressures are very, very high when the knee is flexed and relatively low when the knee is extended. If you're worried about your cartilage health over a lifetime, you probably want to avoid activities that have extremely high localized contact forces or pressures. Okay, so can I summarize this in 10 seconds or less? Yeah. As the knee flexes, knee ligaments become more lax because they're located posterior to the axis of rotation. Localized pressures on the articulating surfaces of the knee are relatively high because of the shape of the femoral condyles. Okay, now I'll go ahead and maintain that there are almost no concepts at all in the entire biomechanics class that are more complex than this one. There's just lots of them. Okay, y'all stay with me. Hopefully you're enjoying yourselves. Okay, so why do some people with degenerative joint disease of the knee keep their trunks flexed and their knees straight when they walk? And again, apologies to my Miami students for repeating the same example. Here's how your book tries to explain this. The textbook we're using uses red to indicate an impairment and green to indicate a compensation for that impairment. And this illustration is from the chapter on gait. So this still looks complicated to me. So I want to simplify it for my notes if I'm a student in this class. So I'm going to superimpose my own drawing over that. And I'll even go another step further and take the person away. So I'm looking at this example of a force pulling downward on an upper part of a lever system. I'm assuming the lower part, representing the shank, is fixed to the ground. Sorry. And then I can ask you all, well, this force, is it going to tend to rotate the upper part clockwise or counterclockwise? Well, I think a elementary school kid could look at this and tell you that this upper part's going to rotate clockwise, or they might say to the right. What's helpful in the biomechanics class is to exaggerate and make clear distinctions. So on the next slide, I've given you two drawings. This is the same one you looked at. And here I have flexed the knee to move that line of force posterior to it. So I'm trying to make it clear and hopefully obvious that on the left, this line will go to rotate the upper segment counterclockwise, as opposed to a line anterior to the center of the knee joint, which will rotate the thigh clockwise. If we're using clinical terms, we say gravity is exerting a flexion moment about the knee on the left, and gravity is exerting an extension moment about the knee on the right. So, how come some people walk with their trunks inclined forward and keep their knees straight? Well, they do it to make up for a weak quadriceps. The quadriceps creates an extension moment about the knee. If I can't activate my quadriceps, then I can manipulate the position of my body so that gravity will act as a knee extensor and compensate for my quadriceps weakness. Now, that weakness could be for lots of reasons, and most of them are beyond the scope of this class. So it's a good idea for your strategy to say to yourself, well, gee, I wonder what I'm supposed to do about that with patients who are walking that way, or what's the best way to strengthen the quadriceps, or all sorts of other questions that are probably the reasons that you actually came to physical therapy school to learn. But for this class, it's best to say, yeah, those are all interesting. I think I'll get it out of my head for a while now. I just want to understand the mechanics. Okay, because there's lots of reasons why you might be weakness. Weakness, for example, is not a biomechanical term. We would just say you're generating much less than the normal amount of extensor torque. Could be due to atrophy, could be due to nervous system problems, could be because it's saving you from some pain. So lots of extremely bright students will have trouble with this class because they can't resist to go on and think more about all the clinically related things. You know, this could be an ontologic gait pattern, could be pain from the muscle, from the tendons, from muscular attachments, from pressure on subchondral bone. Sometimes we walk funny long after the pain is gone because we've developed a bad habit of walking in a weird way. Now, all these things are things you will learn to evaluate specifically and learn to problem solve and learn to treat and help your fellow human beings quite a bit. But don't try and do that all during your biomechanics class. That's my suggestion. So again, it's the mechanical behavior of biological systems, trying to separate a whole into all of its component parts, clarifying the expression by using it in discourse, discussing it with your teachers, with your classmates. Okay, so my suggestion for a strategy. And these talks, by the way, are scheduled for an hour. Mine is not going to be nearly that long unless you guys have lots of questions you want to ask. So take a deep breath, and I think you'll get most of what I have to offer you in the next 10 minutes or so. And we'll go on to enjoy our Thursday afternoons or evenings, doing whatever else you already had planned. Okay, so a strategy, careful plan for achieving a particular goal over a long period of time. Okay, so the strategy, start by optimizing your personal logistics. Consider all your classes and also your personal obligations. And if you haven't done so before, you know, it's time to get out a calendar and really figure out what your best times are to study. You want to make sure to put in time so you can spend time with family and friends. so you can maintain your personal relationships. Those are much more important, I think, than most of our students realize. Then I'll suggest you browse the textbook for each unit. Use the unit objectives and slide sets to create your own study guide. And I think the best study guides are a separate page. I don't think it matters if you do it electronically or physically for every concept. And if I was in charge of you, I would tell you, label the title of the concept, define it, describe it, make up your own example, think of a way to model it with a picture, with a simple statement. Do something with your own hands or with a partner to illustrate and recall that concept. And we usually have those for you to do in our lab sessions. But I think the more you can do laboratory type activities as you're studying, instead of reading the same thing again and again, I think it will lead to a higher level of performance. I suggest to consider, especially beyond the introductory chapters of the textbook that I know you're all still involved with, think about an outside-in study guide. Now, what I mean is that your textbook and traditional illustrations or teaching typically start with inside out, right? You learn the osteology, the bones, the arthrology, the shapes of the joint surfaces. You learn the muscles and nerves. Then you learn what movements are called. After learning all the individual actions. And then you go on to try and analyze real life movements. I think combining that with an outside-in guide for every movement in every plane. Demonstrate and explain the osteokinematics with a plastic model or draw a little picture. Demonstrate and explain the arthrokinematics, movements of the joint surfaces, with a plastic model or a free body diagram. Let me stop here for a second. The worse you draw, the more you should use free body diagrams. Just like if I ask you to explain something, and my tendency is to say, well, I really know it, I just can't explain it. I will challenge you about that. Because I think your ability to explain something defines whether you know it or not. Likewise, if I ask you to visualize something, and you say, well, I can visualize it, I just can't really express it. I'll say, no, that's not true. Visualizing it really means you're able to express it visually. So little drawings that are super simple are very helpful. List the muscles that cause each action. As you list them, palpate them, demonstrate their function with what we call the string method sometimes, holding a string alongside a real person with the string going from the origin to the insertion, and being able to actually visualize if that string was pulling, what way it would move the limb. And then be able to list all the structures that limit range of motion and demonstrate their function with a real person, the string method, a free body diagram. So this is a way of taking all the details that you're learning in the class and putting them into another format, which helps to learn. And also this sort of format, this outside in, I'm calling it, this is the best way to prepare yourself to examine real patients in real life that have come to you for help. Okay, describe and explain accessory movements at other joints that typically accompany this movement. It's silly to think about glenohumeral abduction without also thinking about scapulothoracic upward rotation. And throw in any additional comments. about each movement. Okay, so read the textbook, ask and post questions. One common complaint among all of us instructors in the USA system is that our students don't ask questions. Maybe we haven't presented enough information to give you information to ask questions about. Maybe you feel like you're imposing on us. If we haven't been polite and respectful about answering your questions, let us know. That's part of our job here. In fact, in graduate school, I think it's probably the biggest part of our job is answering questions. Okay, take practice quizzes and sample questions the teachers give you. Ask and post questions after you do those. Share your study guides with each other. Not so much to save time, because creating the study guides is where most learning takes place. But share them for critique. Then read the textbook again, refine your guide, ask and post questions, refine your study guide again. Create and share your own sample questions. So I'm going to take a small detour here about multiple choice questions. As a culture, we become preoccupied with how well people do on multiple choice exams. And it is true that that is the primary way we evaluate your performance here at USA. So, if you're not aware of this already, if you're on the teacher side creating a multiple choice exam, the terminology we use is not correct and incorrect answers. They are called desired responses and distractors. Okay, so we make up a predicate, typically with a blank space. One of your choices is going to be the desired response. And the distractors are typically something similar, but not the best answer. Something the opposite. And very often, something that sounds sophisticated, but actually makes no sense. And if you waste too much time studying education like I did, and studying exam construction, you'll find that this is the typical way most of us are taught how to create multiple choice exams. Keep this in mind as you're studying. So that study page about a particular topic or concept, include similar things that concept is not. Include what would be the opposite. Be confident that you understand that concept and don't get fooled by some sophisticated nonsense. That's a choice. Incorporate a test-taking strategy. There's lots of these around. Many of our students have never had a strategy for taking exams. We're blessed with having really bright people, and they've done okay without any conscious strategy at all. But there's a lot of them that work well. The one I suggest most of the time to students is something that's called the 4-pass strategy. So I sit down to take that multiple choice exam, and I go through it 4 times. The first time, I'm only answering questions that I'm sure of. I'm also going to mark every question as either one of 2 choices, or I have no idea. And I'm not going to beat myself up mentally about being clueless. Beat yourself up about it after the exam. Don't give yourself a hard time. Okay, second time through the exam. Only answer the questions you identified as one of 2 choices. And a trick students sometimes don't use is to listen to them aloud in your mind. Which one sounds like your teacher? You're probably better at this than you might think. Using a predicate, that fill in the blank, that doesn't really sound like your teacher. It's probably not the right answer. Okay. Then the third time you go through the exam, you're just going to concentrate on the clueless items, read them once more, and give it your best guess. Then the fourth time, you're going to go over the whole exam, but you're only going to change answers that you're sure you got wrong. Because when we take an exam, especially, again, if you don't have strategies, we're usually not very self-aware of how much our brains have become fatigued. And so your judgment was much better when you started this exam than here after spending however many minutes you've been working on it. So only change answers that you're sure you got wrong. Most of the answers people change that last time through, they're making a mistake. Once you develop your study guide, you're synthesizing, you're getting yourself go over it again and again. Because almost every student tells me the volume of the content was much more challenging than the difficulty of it. I also suggest that that study guide, use it two different ways in preparing for exams. Go through it in a logical order, typically the way that we present things in class, but also go through it in a random order. Many of us are relatively unaware of how much mental effort it takes to change subjects. So you want to start training yourself for that. We randomize our questions on all of our exams. So you're going to have a question about one concept, then a different one, then a different one. So you want to study that way as well. Okay, we're nearly wrapping up. Questions anybody has or comment you have? Okay. Okay, when I interview students after class, I've been in the habit of doing this for years. I try and chase down the 2 or 3 students who did the best, 2 or 3 students who did the worst. And this is what I find. The most successful students had a study guide they created themselves with lots of models. Strings, they used plastic bones, they did lots of drawings. They did lots of if-then statements that were unambiguous. The least successful students did not create their own study guide. They depended wholly on the slide test from the teacher. They still used the old-fashioned highlighting of a textbook, which is a good idea, but it's very slow. They only analyzed sample questions that were given out. They didn't interact with the teacher. They didn't ask or post any questions online. And most importantly, they became preoccupied with other courses and with personal issues. And these personal issues that you're preoccupied with, many times they're beyond your control. This is not a personal flaw that you have, but it's something you want to try and be aware of and try and manage if you can. Okay. USA, one reason I like teaching here is that it is all about win-win. We get praised as teachers when our students do well. There's absolutely no incentive at all to give students a hard time. The incentive is all towards the positive. My personal history of biomechanics, how I got interested in it as a specific topic, I failed my first class. Just like you guys, my first term, I thought, this is insane. There's just no way that they want me to be responsible for all this stuff. This is just nuts. And fortunately, my teacher was sympathetic, and she let me work in her lab as a remediation. And that's actually how I got interested in the more technical aspects of the field. Okay, anybody have any questions? Okay. If something comes to you, or if you have a suggestion how I could do this better, if I was going to do this talk again, please share them with me. No offense will be taken. Thank you so much for giving me some of your time, and I hope you have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Okay, you too. Take care. I'll see some of you tomorrow morning, first thing.
Thank you so much, you too.
You're